Welcome, Professor Humphrey.
Thank
We are
you.
very happy to see you and can I ask you some questions. And the first one is the following. What's human consciousness is an ancient question that ever since come along the history of thought in all cultures. Do you believe that the answer is closer today than in the past?
I think it has to be, but how much closer, I don't know. I think we've taken some wrong routes about consciousness, and particularly recent scientific investigations have not asked the right questions, which we're beginning to ask, particularly at this meeting. I'm very impressed by the convergence between the tradition I come from, which is from thinking about issues in terms of evolution and about the design of human beings and their minds, and the traditions of Buddhism and contemplation and meditation, which have also been investigating the purposes of consciousness. I mean, question I always ask is, what is consciousness for? And why do we need it? Why can't we just live our lives as robots, getting through the world, performing cognitive operations, perception, decision-making, memory, without having this extraordinary, rich, qualitative life which accompanies it? It would seem it's superfluous. There's no reason for it. It doesn't add anything to the way at least it seems, to the way we think or the way we act in the world. And yet it must do, or else it wouldn't have been designed by evolution. My view is that in the end, the answer must come very much along the lines which Franco Battiato suggested in his presentation today, that the purpose of consciousness is to be known. The very existence of consciousness changes our sense of ourselves, of who we are, of why we exist, of our relations to other people. And for human beings, this could have been an enormous biological advantage. It changed the kind of life we could live in this world. Chimpanzees, monkeys, other animals live a certain sort of life in a particular environment. Human beings have entered a new ecological niche, but it's a spiritual niche, a world in which we can only live because we're spiritual beings. But in the end, our spirituality allows us to reproduce and to be effective in the world beyond the capacity of any other animal. So I look for the meaning of consciousness in the sense of what's it contributed to our lives. I'm not interested in the little local issues of, does consciousness help us solve this problem of attention or that problem of memory. I'm interested in what being conscious is about. Now, at this meeting, I have so many other people who, again, go into consciousness asking, why is it there? Why consciousness rather than not consciousness? Not concerned with tiny details, but with the big picture. And that's why I think it's very promising in a way that we're finding this convergence, and we can bypass the cognitive scientists and the neuroscientists and all the others who are hoping to get a Nobel Prize for their research on consciousness, because in the end, we're going to say, okay, guys, we told you the real answers are going to lie in the traditions of religion and contemplation.
Oh, thank you. We can go deep in these questions with the second question, because is the following. The search of mind implies very important questions like, am I my brain? Is there life beyond that? Or has living a meaning? So what do you think about the role of scientists on answering these questions? And also, do we need also other disciplines to answer these questions?
Well, I think it's a very good question. The issues such as, am I my brain, are answered by a conscious person with the answer no. We don't believe we are our brains. Science tells us we are, and I'm a scientist, and of course I know that there is no more to consciousness than the activity of my brain. But as a human being, as a conscious human being, I can't believe that. And that's the success of consciousness, that it teaches us that we are not purely material beings, that we have another dimension to our life. And I think it was this discovery which probably took place quite late in evolution. I think human consciousness is different from the consciousness of animals. Our consciousness is possibly more mysterious, more paradoxical. It has strange qualities of temporal qualities of kind of richness and thickness, which have been added in evolution, probably quite late on, because for human beings, and human beings alone, it changed their lives. So the answer is that, yes, at some level, science has to answer the question of what are the nerve cells doing, and at least what functions are they performing, and how does that give us this impression or even this illusion of the richness of consciousness. But the answers to the question of why consciousness exists are going to have to come from phenomenology on one side, but also from history, from anthropology, from poetry, from the humanities, because they are the places in which consciousness plays out, in which it shows its power.
Oh. In fact, interdisciplinarity, we can call it in this way, is the increasing trend of the contemporary studies in many ambits. But what is the ground where the different disciplines can meet each other, can understand each other about you? And also, do you think that exists a shareable truth, if we can use this word?
What truth?
About shareable. We can share this truth about this specific subject, the consciousness, in this interdisciplinarity of the studies.
Well, not yet, but I hope so. I mean, I think the material sciences have a lot of catching up to do. They have to take seriously issues of first-person methodology, the results, the empirical evidence which comes from first-person methods and so on, which would be a new adventure for science. There's been very little recognition of the value of first-person experience, and you can see why. Of course, for many sciences, it's important to take the person out of it, to take the individual experimenter, investigator out of the picture, so that all the empirical results can be agreed upon by whatever scientist is coming to the same problem. But in principle, we can't approach consciousness that way. I, of course, in talking about my consciousness and in trying to solve the problem of it, I believe I'm doing the same thing as you are in your investigations. But we have to have the trust that in the end, it is just trust that we are investigating the same phenomenon. And that's, of course, something which in science, you don't never have to go that way. But it's intrinsic to the problem of consciousness. It's private, it's local, it's individual, and it's part of its function to be so. I mean, in my analysis, if consciousness was not so extraordinarily paradoxically private and special and only accessible from the one point of view which we have, we ourselves are making it, and only the individual who makes consciousness can observe his own consciousness. That's part of what it is to be conscious, and it's why it's so wonderful, and it's what in the end gives us this sense of ourselves and makes us so special. I've talked before about that it gives us the sense of a self worth having. I mean, something which we can hang on to and build on. Now, those particular ways of categorizing the data are going to be, are not the ways which are familiar to science. I don't think that means that the neuroscientists and the biologists, even the physicists in the end, can't understand our way of talking or can't see how it will connect with theirs. But they're going to have to loosen up a bit.
I have a question about what you told before. You told my personal question about consciousness is what's consciousness for, or why it is. Mm-hmm. But you think that asking what's for means what's the use. And if you mean this, there are probably other questions that we can put in a different way. Maybe we can ask, what does it mean? Because if we ask only what's the use of consciousness, we are inside a very clear path of questions,
Yes, but you see, my answer would be, its use is to mean something. That the use of consciousness is to be meaningful, because it's its meaning which enriches our lives and makes us ambitious to develop ourselves and our culture in particular ways. And so that in the end turns out to be what its biological use is. So I don't think they're separate questions. So I see your point that if we look at it in a purely utilitarian point of view, we would miss the point. I mean, it could have been, say, consciousness could have had a different answer. It could have been in order to improve our attention or something like that. That would have been a practical use, and in the end, I think it wouldn't have given it any meaning at all. There wouldn't have been, you don't ask what the meaning is of our, the meaning of the fact that our liver takes poisons from our blood. That's its job, it's its function, but it would be odd to say that that's its meaning. But in the case of consciousness, its meaning is its use. At least that's how I look at it. I think it's. I agree that I, coming from a biological background, probably approach the question initially from a different point of view. I want to know the adaptive advantage. In the end, that means something really practical. What, in the end, makes it possible for human beings to reproduce themselves? Because it's only by reproducing ourselves with the genes for consciousness. Of course, consciousness isn't entirely genetically based because it's shaped by culture. But if we didn't have the genes for having the kind of minds we do, we wouldn't be conscious. And those genes are there because our parents and their parents and their parents and so on survived better than their neighbors because of the nature of their consciousness. So in the end, it has to be very practical. But, and that's of course different when Franco or yourselves look into your mind and ask, why am I here? You're not asking a question about, about having children. But in the end, I think these questions will converge. Now, it's important that I should say that I think consciousness it's taken a lot of design to put it into our heads. There were preliminary stages in evolution, of the evolution of the mind, of sensation, in which the kind of elements required would have been there. But in the last stages, and as I said, they may have been quite recent, some very special design work went on within the brain to produce, as I think of it, particular kinds of feedback loops, which have particular strange temporal qualities, which produce the sense of a moment which exists outside of time, so that we can occupy the present tense of consciousness. And all that requires very, very careful, matching of inputs to outputs and timing in the brain and so on. There must have been some very, only because it brought adaptive advantage did that design work get done.
So, what's the hardest question to be solved in the cognitive studies?
Well, I think there's, if you believe in the kind of solution which I'm suggesting for consciousness, there remains, of course, what looks like still the hard problem. I think that consciousness can be identified, at least the main, most important element of consciousness is sensation. And sensation is what provides the basis for our sense of self. We are selves who live in the present tense of sensation. But then you can ask, well, okay, here's your analysis of sensation. In this case, it's a particular form of activity. I think we make sensations. But I'll say, well, okay, in the end, if we could go down to the level of the brain and show what it is we are doing, let's describe it in functional, even perhaps in mathematical terms of what we're doing. Why does this activity, performing this function, have this quality? The question is, can we go beyond that? And is there an answer to that question? I believe that this is one of those questions where questioning stops. That in the end, that's how it is. To undertake this activity in our brains is to sense red, or to feel pain, or to taste an anchovy on our tongues. There is nothing more to be said about it. That to do this is to be in that state, in that phenomenal state. Now, that may seem unsatisfactory, and I can see, in many ways, I think it is sort of unsatisfactory, but there have to be final truths about the world. To take an analogy, I don't want to push it too strongly from physics. String theorists who are interested in the nature of matter will say that a string, this fundamental kind of unit of matter, a string vibrating in a particular way with a particular frequency is an electron, or is a quark, or is a photon. And you ask them, well, why is it? And they say, well, in the end, it's because a string vibrating in that way has all the properties and none other of a photon, or an electron, or a quark. So if one thing has all the properties that the other thing has, and the second thing has all the properties that the first has, then they're the same thing. And what I want to say in the end is that if our minds are performing whatever it is, let's say, which produces a sensation of red, then the performance of this activity by our mind has all the properties of being in a conscious state, of sensing red. In other words, whatever tests we could impose about what it feels like to sense red and so on, whatever would be true, the answers would be true of the phenomenal state. The same answers would be true, if we could put it in the third person, of what's going on in my brain. So that there's an identity. But this takes a lot, it's still, I know, as I write it down in my books and I write experience of red equals reading equals this particular phenomenon, I realize there's it looks like a big gap still. And I can tell you that in the reviews of this book I've just brought out called Seeing Red, many kind reviews about it, and they all say what a wonderful book it is, but they say, of course, but in the end, he hasn't solved the hard problem.
I have two more questions. One is about the method and the other one about the qualia you were talking about. The first one is about the method, because as you told, the meeting between science, cognitive science, and first-person methodologies is just its first beginning. So, in your opinion, which are the assumptions that science cannot renounce in the challenge of understanding consciousness with the first-person method? I mean, which are the constraints?
Well, I mean, obviously there are some very basic standards which science has to agree to, which is that we understand what we're saying, we agree on the terms, that we can't, there must be no ambiguity about what we mean when we make a statement in science about evidence or about explanation, that we must be honest, scrupulously honest, that if we find results which go against our hypothesis, then we have to accept that the hypothesis is wrong, and we don't then say, oh, well, I didn't mean that. Of course, we can change the hypothesis to meet the new data. I mean, the standards of science are quite demanding, but they're the same, I think, in physiology or in chemistry as they should be in a science of mind. I mean, clarity, honesty, rationality.
And I have a very special question about qualia, because in your speech and also in your works, quite often you talk about a particular sensation, very human sensation that touched me deeply, about the feeling of loneliness, the feeling of death, the feeling of the questioning for the meaning and so on. And there are specific qualia associated to these questions. I mean, we can feel what we ask for. And, okay, from your words, it seems to me that you think science has not enough tools to force the question too much, to an answer. But these tools has to come from different sides. So my question is, which sides, and if we can at least share our unshareability?
That's a lot of big questions there. It's right, I write a lot about the lack of meaning and the problem which it poses. I think that human beings entered a very dangerous phase of their existence when they became clever enough to ask questions about why we are here, the very questions which Franco and others put to us, but which we all ask since we're children. I mean, it's not a problem for any other animal. For a chimpanzee even never asks, why is there something rather than nothing? Why am I here? Why am I myself rather than some other self? Those questions become not only the obvious questions for a human being to ask, but also the ones which because of our own rationality, we realize we can't answer. I mean, we're clever enough to ask the questions. We're also clever enough to realize that the answers we give are unsatisfactory, most of them. The answers don't lie within science. Some people would argue that that Darwin and evolution contains its own answer to the problem of purpose and why human beings have evolved and so on. I don't think it does. I think we seek for answers on another level, and they are supplied by some of the insights we get when we contemplate consciousness and see the nature of spiritual reality. I'm going to disappoint you, though, because I think in many ways those answers are illusory. I think they work, they satisfy us, they keep us alive, they allow us to go out, get up in the morning and lead a happy life during the day in which we think there is purpose and meaning in life because, just feel what it's like to be alive and to be in the presence of other living souls. But in the last analysis, I think that I wouldn't want to say that they provide an answer to the questions we ask. And so I think there's, as other philosophers have thought, that actually the practice of philosophy is very undermining. In the end, it's bound, if it's honest, to destroy illusions. And the question is, to what extent should we share those answers? If, let's say, I can demonstrate and persuade people that consciousness, as we experience in all its richness and mystery, is in fact just an operation of the brain which has been designed by nature to trick us into believing that we're more special than we really are. That's not good news. And since if the reason that nature had to give us that sense was to allow us to live, then to take it away would be to condemn us to death. Now, that's a real problem, possibly, for philosophy or psychology. What do we do with those kinds of results? To give you another analogy, this case isn't so on such a big scale, but we know that placebo medicine is incredibly important. Most medicine, in fact, works through placebos. Placebos work because the patients believe that the medicine is real and is going to be effective. If we could explain the nature of placebos and demonstrate that people are responding to a lie, then maybe if people are told that, they'll stop responding, in which case the medicines are going to stop working, most of them, and the doctors and the priests and so on are not going to have the effects they have. And so, in other words, science would have undermined something which for many millennia and maybe millions of years even has made a positive contribution to human lives. Now, I think we've got the problem even more strongly when it comes to these grand philosophical issues. And the question is, what do we do? Do we keep quiet, or do we share what we believe to be the truth? Or I hope there's possibly another way still, and maybe people at this meeting are going to supply it, which is not, you don't have to go the way of my pessimism, but to say that actually the things I point to as being answers to the problem of consciousness, and I say are deep down they're illusory. Well, maybe Franco or Baker Roshi or Brother David are going to be able to persuade me that there is real meaning there, not just illusory meaning, not just as if meaning.
So we have to conclude. We have many questions, but this is the last one. And I tried to ask these questions to all the speakers of this meeting. And so, remaining on a plane of the first-person analysis or methodologies, may I ask you the most important experience in your life?
Well, I was going to say, I hope it hasn't happened yet. I don't want to always have to look back and say that was the most important experience of my life. The headmaster of my school, when I was 10 years old, on my birthday, said to me, he said, "Nick, this is the best age of your life." And I thought, help. I'm always going to be looking back and thinking, I missed it, I passed it. So I think my answer is the most important experience of my life is yet to come.